Many years ago, now that you know how old I am, I spoke at the National War College for the first time, and I was introduced simply as the youngest person ever to address the National War College. And I wish I could get introductions like that still. Those days are gone. I'm here to talk about the results of a study group of about 40 people in Washington. Roughly half of us were Iranian experts, Iranian Americans for the most part, and half were political military experts, which is where I come from. My Iran knowledge is learned from these other members of the task force, but I think I know a little bit, and I can try and answer your questions and talk about Iran a little bit. I see that everyone has a copy of the report. There will be a test at the end. But I see that you're also scoring me on the presentation, so if you'll be lenient, I'll be lenient in return. So. The study group met last summer and fall. The report came out in November. And we began by looking at Iran's nuclear program. This has been a concern of the United States for many years. And we have tried both coercive policies like sanctions and covert operations to stop the program, and we've tried diplomacy to try to engage the Iranians to stop the program. When we were meeting, many people were arguing that we should use military force to stop the program. Last summer particularly, the Israelis were quite concerned that Iran was very close to acquiring a weapon, and they were urging the US government to conduct some sort of military strikes to preempt this possibility. And in fact, it was that debate which raged in Washington and elsewhere in the country that prompted this study group, this project to get going. So we started by looking at the program, and we concluded that they were some years from having a nuclear weapons capability. There was no doubt that they were exploring weapons technologies. They were enriching uranium, which is the essential one possible essential ingredient in nuclear weapon. And they were experimenting with the other things you need to build a weapon. We did not think that they've decided as yet how far they want to progress. They can acquire the capability to build a weapon but not build one. They could actually build a weapon but not tell people about it, sort of what the Israelis have done. Or they could go ahead and build a weapon and test it and declare themselves a nuclear power. Governments don't like to make decisions until those are necessary, and since they're some years from actually having the capability, we concluded they really haven't reached the decision as yet as to how far to go. I'm glad to say that since our report came out, but not because of our report, both the Israeli government and the US government's official assessment now is that they are 3 to 5 years away from having a nuclear weapons capability. Their program is continuing. They're making steady but slow progress. And no doubt someday, unless they divert or are diverted, they will have a weapons capability, but so far they're not there. So this is important because it means that there's time to explore different ways of persuading them not to go into an actual weapons capability. We then looked at what was the domestic scene in Iran, and we had a working group of these experts. The scene is pretty bleak for most Iranians. Economically, Iran has not advanced. It's a centralized economy for the most part, at least in its principal industries, particularly oil and gas industry. It's badly mismanaged. There's a lot of corruption in the allocation of resources. Investments are not made smartly, and often siphoned off to Zurich or wherever they end up in some bank account somewhere. And Iran has not advanced economically, particularly in view of its potentially very rich oil and gas resources. There's something like 25% unemployment in Iran. There's a high inflation rate. The economy has been hurt by the economic sanctions that have been put on Iran, and I'll speak a little more about that shortly. Last fall, while we were meeting, there was a devaluation of the currency, and what they call the Iranian bazaar, the small businessmen that run the shops and small businesses in Tehran, actually went on general strike for some time, which was unheard of before then. So there's a very poor economic situation. Politically, the scene is equally dismal. Most of you know, I'm sure, that in almost exactly 2 years ago, Ahmadinejad stole the election, the presidential election, which was widely recognized. There were mass protests that were put down with great violence, sort of what the Syrians are doing now, and that many people in the Green movement, the democracy movement, have been arrested, have been jailed, some have been killed. But even among the Iranian elites, even among the groups that are the beneficiaries of the system that was established in 1979, there's a very sharp political conflict going on, a very fierce struggle for power and influence. Ahmadinejad, in a way, represents a new type of a conservative Iranian. He's viewed as a Persian nationalist. He comes from the Revolutionary Guards. These are people that fought the war against Iraq in the 1980s, that suffered quite considerably. They're all veterans of that war, and they have been maneuvering to seize authority and power and the economic benefits that go from that from the more established elites, the clerical elites, the ruling religious classes, the people in the parliament, people in the judiciary, people in the traditional armed forces, and so forth. And this conflict has been going on for some time, but has worsened considerably in the past year. We believe it's been worsened in part because of the sanctions policy and because of Iran's growing isolation that have resulted from its nuclear program, which is a good thing, we'll come to. But you may have, only within the last few weeks, this conflict has really become very prominent. Ahmadinejad attempted to push the oil minister out and take over that ministry himself, and he attempted to fire the intelligence minister and put his protege in charge of that ministry. And after only a few days, the supreme leader, which is the leading clerical figure and the person, according to the Iranian system of government, who can intervene and overturn presidential decisions, said, well, what part of supreme don't you understand? So he put the oil minister and the intelligence minister back in place. Ahmadinejad went off somewhere and sulked for 8 days. He didn't go to any meetings. He wouldn't talk to these people. He's since come back. But it's almost as if he's already a lame duck. Their election is in 2013, their next presidential election. And it's almost as if the more traditional elites have sidelined him. Now, it's not clear whether he's the leader of the Revolutionary Guard and all that represents, or he's the front man for more powerful people in the Guard. And so perhaps the Guard isn't sidelined, but that's all still murky. But this conflict is very interesting, and it has both positive and negative implications for our ability to reach a resolution of this conflict with them over their nuclear program. On the negative side, we don't know who we're negotiating with and who really has authority. In a year ago, last fall, there was an agreement reached in Geneva that the Iranian representatives signed up to, that they would move the uranium they had enriched to 20% for a medical reactor they have in Tehran, which needs refueling. They would send that to Russia. Russia would replenish it. It would then go to France, which would turn it into fuel rods, which is what they need for the reactor. And they signed out. And that was a great relief to us, because 20% enriched uranium brings them much closer to the 90% enriched uranium, which is what you need for a nuclear weapon. When the negotiators came back to Tehran, the supreme leader, or someone, we don't really know who, intervened again, and they said, no, we're not doing this deal. It's our right to enrich uranium. We're not going to agree to send it out of the country. So all that was for naught. And there have been subsequent rounds of negotiations, but it hasn't been possible to make any real progress since then. So with that as background, let's then look at options, and let me report what our study group recommended. We began by looking at the military option. The people on the study group that were the political military experts included some retired military, some retired Navy admirals, including Admiral Fallon, who was the commander of Central Command, the command in charge of that region, including an admiral who ran Department of Energy's nuclear program. It included retired diplomats, and it included people who served in the Defense Department in a civilian capacity at high levels in Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush Jr. administration. So it was a bipartisan group, and fairly conservative, actually, in its makeup. And to my surprise, the group unanimously agreed that we should not use a military strike against Iran. And there were a number of reasons for this. One was, militarily, it's not a case of sending a couple of airplanes over to take out a single facility like the Israelis did in Syria or in Iraq at an earlier time. It would be a very substantial strike to take out their whole nuclear infrastructure. Moreover, we would expect that Iran would retaliate for any strike. And therefore, if the US were to do it, we would attempt to preempt that retaliation by going after their armed forces, by taking out their ability to retaliate as best we could. And this would mean that we're talking about a strike involving hundreds or even thousands of missions, and something that would go on over a period of weeks at a minimum. Moreover, Iran would still have considerable opportunities to retaliate through its terrorist organizations. Hezbollah, Hamas could retaliate against Israel, for example, or they could strike facilities in the Persian Gulf, oil facilities, or US military bases. They could move ground forces into Iraq. There's lots of options available to them. So a military strike on our part certainly could severely damage, attrit, set back the nuclear program, but it would unleash a period of uncertainty and the possibility of yet another war in the Middle East for the United States, which would not be wise, particularly at this time. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mullins, agreed with that conclusion, as does Secretary Gates. Moreover, what a strike would do would make true to the Iranians the founding myth of the Iran Revolution, which is that the United States is out to destroy Iran. And so it would unite the country, as it is not now and never has been really, and no doubt they could at some future point rebuild their nuclear program unless we were willing to actually put troops in and put a regime in, and we know how difficult that is. We've learned some years ago about that. So we ruled out a military option. We then looked at the other coercive options, sanctions, and covert operations. And these seem to be having very good effects in putting pressure on the Iranian regime to come to a resolution of this issue that can satisfy our concerns that they're not going to build a nuclear weapon. There's two forms of sanctions. There are the United Nations sanctions, which limit sales of nuclear materials and the specialized equipment you need for nuclear weapons. It limits sales of conventional armaments, and it goes after certain other high technology sales to Iran. And those are being followed pretty generally by virtually all countries. The Russians, for example, after the last round of sanctions, UN sanctions in June, a year ago, canceled the sale of surface-to-air missiles to Iran. To do that, they had to send back $800 million to Iran, which they had already paid up front for the missiles. Now, Mr. Putin clearly was not too happy about that, but it shows that they are following the UN sanctions. The more effective set of sanctions, though, are financial sanctions that the US has put on unilaterally, the European Union has put on the Japanese, the Australians, the Canadians, Koreans, just about all the advanced economies in the world. Not the Chinese and not the Russians. But what these sanctions say, essentially, to banks, to insurance companies, to investors, to oil companies, you can do business in Iran if you want, but if you do that, you will not do business with us. And these are enforced by the Treasury Department. So say we learn there's a Turkish bank that's going to invest $50 million into some oil and gas project in Iran. Well, the Undersecretary of Treasury goes to Ankara, or wherever the bank is, Istanbul, and says, okay, here's your choice. You want to do this project, or you want to do business with the United States? And this has been very effective. All the Western oil companies have pulled out of Iran. Iran has trouble finding investment for any infrastructure problem. The Chinese continue to do some business, but they've been pretty good at following this. They don't want to lose access to US and European and Japanese markets either, so they've been pretty good on this. And it's been a very effective tool, and this is what is severely hampering Iran's economic growth. Their whole future depends on developing its oil and gas resources. And these are offshore resources. They need Western technology. They need Western investment. And they face a very bleak future if these sanctions continue to be enforced. Some countries, no one knows who, also have been conducting covert operations in Iran. You've probably heard of the Stuxnet virus that disrupted their enrichment. There's been some sabotage. Since Iran has to go into the black market to get these things it needs for its nuclear program, it doesn't really know who it's dealing with. So it's been possible for some clever agencies to sell them through these third parties defective equipment or defective materials which have set back their program. Their program's been going on since 1989. It's more than 20 years now, and they're still, as the official estimate is, 3 to 5 years from having a weapons capability. That's quite a substantial period of time, so something is clearly hampering their progress there. So we thought that these sanctions should be continued and the covert operations should be continued and tightened as possible, their implementation tightened, and there's been steady progress being made on that. There's legislation pending in the House and the Senate, separate legislation that would put on additional sanctions and hold the administration, force the administration to sanction companies more quickly, which the administration opposes. The administration says, we're better off when we can go to a bank and say, you have to make this choice, because then they make the choice not to deal with Iran. Once we sanction them and say, you can't do business here, well then they're happy to do business with Iran because they don't have the other choice. But each of these legislative pieces requires some careful attention. Some of them would hurt ordinary people without getting at the government or the ruling elites. Some would probably make sense. Each one, we didn't take a position on this pending legislation, but each deserves careful thought, I'd say. Then we looked at the positive side of our carrot and stick approach to the diplomacy. And here we were critical of the administration in that we felt that neither the Bush administration, when it started dealing with Iran, engaging Iran in the second term, nor the Obama administration has taken the kinds of positions that are strong enough to induce Iran to want to reach an agreement. They might want to reach it because the sanctions and the international isolation are causing unrest in the country and they'd be afraid of losing their base of power, but we don't think that alone can do it. They have to also have a cover. They have to be able to say, here's what we gained by reaching this deal on the nuclear program. And what we think needs to be offered is, first of all, to recognize that they do have a right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. They are signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and every signatory to that treaty has such a right. Many countries do enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. This is assured by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which conducts inspections of these facilities and safeguards the materials that are produced and makes sure they're used, not diverted into weapons programs. We think additional conditions have to be put on Iran because Iran has followed a secretive path and has not been cooperative with the IAEA at times, although the IAEA does inspect all its declared facilities. The most important condition is that Iran would have to implement what's called the additional protocol. Many countries have done this. The basic agreement for a country that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty with the International Atomic Energy Agency is that agency has the right to inspect any facility which the country declares is involved in nuclear activity. The additional protocol, in addition, says the IAEA can inspect undeclared facilities, facilities that it suspects are involved in nuclear activities. Suspects because someone's intelligence agency told them that. Many countries are implementing this now, and of course it's a much more powerful tool, particularly with a country like Iran, which has a history of conducting secret activities. So that would be a condition, but we would say, which we have not said to this point, that if you accept these conditions, and there are others spelled out in the book, we will accept your right to enrich uranium for use in your power reactors and in your medical reactors, but not enrich uranium to a higher level that's necessary for nuclear weapons, which is their pledge in the NPT. In addition, we thought the US should establish a separate bilateral negotiation with Iran. We don't have any talks with Iran. American diplomats are not permitted to talk to their counterparts. There's been a couple exceptions made, but the American representative to the IAEA, for example, cannot talk to the Iranian representative to the IAEA. We thought that's kind of silly. We should start to engage them on the normal course of diplomatic activities. In addition, we should have a separate bilateral negotiation on issues of common concern. There are many conflicts between us. We've had a nasty history over, if you ask an Iranian, since 1953, when we overthrew their government and put the Shah into power. If you ask an American, since 1979, when they seized our embassy and held our diplomats hostage. But since then, we supported Iraq in its war against Iran. We provided intelligence and military equipment and other support to Iraq, which was a big grievance on the Iranians' part. They support terrorist organizations, which bombed the Marine barracks in Lebanon and the embassy in Beirut in the 1980s. We shot down one of their civilian airliners. It was a mistake, but we shot down a civilian airliner. Their terrorist organization bombed our barracks in Saudi Arabia. There's no shortage of grievances on each side's part. We also have some common interests. We have a common interest in stopping the drug trade. Most of the opium in the world begins as poppy in Afghanistan, crosses the Iraqi border, and then goes up into Western Europe or into the former Soviet Union. A lot of it stays in Iran. They have a heck of a drug problem themselves. So we could cooperate on that. In the year and a half or so following 9/11, the Iranians were very helpful in helping us to get rid of the Taliban and establish the Karzai government in Afghanistan. They have a lot of influence with some of the ethnic groups in Afghanistan. In fact, in 2003, they offered a wide-ranging negotiation on Afghanistan and other issues between us, which we turned down at the time, a matter of hubris, I think. So we could discuss Afghanistan with them. We could discuss egress from the Persian Gulf, ensuring free access. They have an interest in getting their oil out. We have an interest in getting oil out of the Gulf as well. So there are some smaller issues, and if we can make progress on those, maybe then we could turn to the tougher issues, like their support of terrorist organizations and so forth. There are also all these economic claims each side has made against the other. So we think that the promise of this, or this type of negotiation, bilateral, should supplement the multilateral nuclear negotiation. And finally, well, let me skip that. Let me just go to the punchline here. And this is the most difficult issue. And the group, my study group didn't agree, so I'm going to give you my personal view. The most difficult issue will come, or might come, if this diplomacy does not succeed, and it might not, or if the sanctions don't force Iran to concede, which they might not. We called the diplomatic solution the least bad option, actually. It probably doesn't have, more than a 50% chance to succeed, if that. So the day might come in 3 years, or more likely 5 years, or maybe 10 years, when Iran is on the verge of having a nuclear weapon. And the question is, should we undertake military action at that point? Or could we deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran? And different people will have different views on that. My view is we deterred and contained a nuclear-armed Soviet Union for many years. The Soviet Union had 10,000 nuclear warheads on immediate alert, ready to be launched at the United States. The Israelis say if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, it would be an existential threat to them, meaning their whole country could be destroyed. We lived throughout the Cold War with an existential threat. If 10,000 Soviet warheads landed in the US, you know, goodbye. Or you wouldn't want to be here if you did survive, I don't think. So, but we deterred the Soviet Union. Iran, if it does develop nuclear weapons, would have a small number, 10, 20, who knows, a handful. The Israelis already have hundreds of nuclear weapons on many types of platforms, which could survive any attack. So if Iran attacked Israel, Iran itself would be destroyed in totality. We have thousands of nuclear warheads. If Iran somehow were to be able to attack us, we could certainly retaliate with devastating force against Iran. So my preference would be, rather than to start a new war in the Middle East, even if they did develop nuclear weapons, would be to deter and contain them, just as we seek to contain them now in their influence in the region. So with that perhaps controversial conclusion, let me stop and open the floor for your comments, questions.
Oil production of Iran in terms of world production, and how much is it being diminished as a result of world efforts, and what could be the consequences of the collapse of the Iranian oil industry?
The question is, how important is Iran's oil production, and what would be the consequence if its production collapsed? I don't know the exact figure. Iran is the second largest producer in the Gulf, although it has been steadily declining. It's declining because it's not developing its reserves, and it doesn't have the technology to produce more efficiently from its old fields. The Saudis have been further diminishing Iran's market by discounting oil from its fields to the Chinese and to other customers of Iran to get them to stop buying Iranian oil and thereby make the sanctions stronger. I believe there would be some effect on price, but not a catastrophic one, if all of Iranian production was stopped. And part of the sanctions legislation I managed would try to embargo Iranian oil exports altogether. Yes, sir?
In last week's New Yorker, Seymour Hersh had an article that said that since 2003, they stopped the pursuit of a weapons development program. Does he know what he's talking about?
The question is, Seymour Hersh had an article in New Yorker claiming that the Iranians stopped their weapons program in 2003. No, I don't think he does, and I was rather surprised to see that, and the administration responded very sharply because they felt that hurt their ability to get countries to implement the sanctions. There was a national intelligence estimate in 2003 which reached that conclusion, which had many people shaking their head. They perhaps did stop for a short while when we invaded Iraq and listed them as one of the axis of evil, and they might have been concerned that they were next on the list. But once they saw us entangled in Iraq and still in Afghanistan and the atmosphere in this country, they resumed the program. In the last IAEA report, they list 7 specific activities by Iranian military organizations which they say are suspect about weaponization and are looking for answers from clarification from Iran about what's up. Yes, sir?
Question about the new power vacuums with America leaving both Iraq and Afghanistan, probably sooner than later. How do you think those dynamics will affect the pursuit of this environment?
That's a very good question, which is what will be the effect of the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and eventually Afghanistan, maybe sooner rather than later, will it create a power vacuum that would help Iran? There's considerable concern about that by the Saudis particularly, who see Shia-dominated Iraq as permitting Iran to extend its influence. I don't know that that would happen. The Iraqis are Shia, but they're Arabs and not Persians, and there's differences there. And Iraq is, I think, unlikely to serve as a surrogate for Iran and its attempts to extend its influence. And similarly, Afghanistan, I don't think it has that. Its influence is up in the north, not with the Pashtuns, which are the majority in that country. There will be other sources of influence. The Turks. Turkey is certainly extending its diplomacy into that region and is becoming a more and more important and a much more powerful source of influence because it has a growing and developing economy and a very good military and so forth. Yes?
I know the protests have not been successful, but is there any indication that a younger generation is wanting a different way of life?
It's the question is whether a younger generation of Iranians might be seeking a different way of life.
I think I can answer that because the ex-patriots I know that have gone to Iraq say that Iraq is very safe, but to keep your trap shut. You can go out and
There's really several Irans. Yeah. There's definitely there's the Iranian middle class, which is tends to be secular and kind of Western in taste and culture, and more young people are like that. And those are the people that were out protesting for democracy that we saw that were beat down so harshly. There's also the poorer Iranians, the working class Iranians that were the base of the revolution. Many of you are old enough to remember seeing those mobs that were out there in '79, their hatred for America. That's the base for the current regime, for the Islamic Republic. And we don't really know what the balance is. The way the sanctions will work, if they work, is that the economic situation of that group, of the poorer working class Iranians, will become so harsh that the regime will fear that it's losing its political base and it could be toppled, and therefore they better reach an agreement. That's how the pressure will work if it does. Yes, sir.
Just to follow up on that, U.S. engagement, well, maybe you won't have to repeat it if I go there.
Yeah.
U.S. engagement policy was criticized a year ago on this point because we muted a little bit our criticism of the regime and our support for the dissidents in the street because we were trying to engage with the regime at the same time. It's a little bit outside the brief of your report, but you can talk about that balance between trying to get a nuclear-free Iran and at the same time you're trying to give support to the dissidents.
Yeah. That's a real dilemma for any administration, and it was a source of conflict. This study group was divided into working groups, and it was very controversial within the Iran working group, because even if you don't mute your criticism, just negotiating with the regime in a way legitimates the regime. And some people say, well, you shouldn't be talking to these people with bloody hands. The conclusion of the Iran experts in our group was that unfortunately the Green Movement is not in a position to gain power now or any time in the foreseeable future. And that in fact they the more pressure we put on in Iran, the more we talk about the military option, for example, the harder it becomes, the less space there is for democratic reforms, the harsher the repression is, the more that other Iran rallies around the regime. So their conclusion was not only so that we can stop the nuclear program before it becomes weapons, but to give more space to the democracy advocates. We should engage the government. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Are you able to explain the psychosocial differences between the Shiite Arab in Iraq, for example, and the Shiite Persian in Iran? Because I don't quite understand what those differences between the Persian, Shia, and the Arab.
Well, the question is, what's the difference between the Shia in Iran and the Shia in Iraq? First of all, there's this interesting rivalry, more than a rivalry, as to where the center of Shia learning and teaching should be. Where's the real authority? Is it in the Iranian cities where it's been, or now that Iraq is no longer under the heel of Saddam Hussein, should it be in, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting, Karbala, where Ayatollah Sistani is. So that's one struggle. But there's also a basic, it's a nationalistic thing. There's the Persians and there are the Arabs. And they have fought over the years. Persia ruled that part of the world for many centuries. So there's a conflict between Arabs and Persians that goes back, many, many years. Yes?
Yes. I have a question that has to do with the Arab Spring, the term Arab Spring, and of course its impact on Iran and diplomacy. But more importantly would be your thoughts about how we can use our diplomacy as it relates to Iran to try to have influence over what happens in the future there because of what's happening through the Arab Spring since January.
The question is, what is the Arab Spring and how can U.S. diplomacy take advantage of that to further our goals with respect to Iran? I think Arab Spring is as much the result of economic deprivation in many of these countries as it is effort for greater democracy. All these countries suffer from was a population bulge among younger people. They all have very high birth rates, and there's this huge expansion of young people. It's like 50% of the population in many of these countries are under 40 or under 20. And these people are growing up and there's no opportunity for them. They don't see how they'll make a living and how they can improve their lot and the lots of their families. And it's in part because of the centralized economy, a lot of the corruption from the ruling elites. So it's as much an economic thing, to my mind, as a cry for democratic rights and principles. In the long run, I think the U.S. will benefit if these revolutions succeed. It'll take away Iran's main argument, which is that the United States is supporting these repressive regimes, and therefore you need to turn to our model to better the lot of your people. It shows that that's a lie. Iran's been unimportant in these revolutions and doesn't play a role. It could hurt if the revolution in Syria were to succeed. It would hurt Iran a great deal because Syria is its closest ally in the region. And it's through Syria that Iranian weapons make their way to Hezbollah, and it gives Iran access to the Mediterranean. So it could help in that sense. Certainly, the U.S., by supporting the overthrow of repressive dictators, and particularly those that use force to repress these popular uprisings, like the Syrian government, I think would help us a great deal in developing more favorable attitudes toward the U.S. in the region. So, yes, sir, and then.
Could our sanctions perhaps provide economic support for these deprived youth, and such perhaps tie it to a part of understanding the issues better? It seems to me that maybe because of this skewed problem of all these unhappy, violent youths, that part of our sanctions could be to assist in educational opportunities of learning. That's something that I would sure look at.
Well, that's more part of the diplomatic. The question is whether our sanctions could help the deprived parts of the population to educate themselves and so forth. The sanctions are restrictions on trade and investment and so forth, but our diplomacy includes an aspect of public diplomacy, which does seek to bring greater knowledge to these people of the rest of the world, to show how the rest of the world lives so that they can understand that the way they are living and their deprivation is not necessarily the way of the world. It strives to give them greater access to the internet and to social media so they can communicate with one another and so forth.
A quick tag on to this. Is it logic to think that we will never have diplomatic relations with Iran?
I certainly...
Repeat the question, please.
Sorry, the question is it illogical to think that we'll ever have diplomatic relations with Iran? And I would certainly hope not. I think the politics in both countries makes it difficult. In the U.S., when a president pursues an engagement policy, he gets criticized from part of the political spectrum. Obama will not initiate, I'm sure, any renewed push for engagement, in the 16 months between now and the election. And in Iran, the same thing happens. They say, you want to deal with the great Satan? I mean, you can't deal with the devil. But I do think that, at the appropriate moment, perhaps in 2013, it would be possible through a more enlightened diplomatic approach on our side and a greater need on their side to end their isolation, that it would be possible to begin normal diplomatic interactions and eventually reach full diplomatic relations. Yes, sir.
Returning to the question posed before about the possible power vacuum as a result of the withdrawal of Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq, you didn't mention whether or not Russia might be a power player in as much as easy access to the Gulf would certainly be very desirable. Then again, they have had a little bit of a comeuppance in Afghanistan and left tail between the legs. But what about Russia in the long term?
The question is whether Russia can play a greater role in this region over the long term. The Russians have been very cooperative with us in putting sanctions on Iran and enforcing the sanctions. This is perhaps the only, but it's certainly the biggest payoff from the policy of resetting our relationship with Russia. They don't seem to have any appetite for foreign adventures now because of their internal problems, particularly in the Caucasus, the region that borders the Middle East. Certainly over the longer term, if they grow economically, if they gain the resources which would permit them to rebuild their armed forces, they could again play an influential role in the region as they did during the Cold War. But I think that's decades away. I think their economy is in such bad shape, they're so far behind technologically, and their armed forces are in such disarray that they have a long way to go before they can do that.
Maybe we have time for two more questions or so.
Yes.
On the other hand, China has a deep thirst for oil right now. And will that in any way hinder the efforts towards sanctions?
The question is whether China's need for oil will hinder the sanctions application. And the answer is yes, and it has already. China has been the brake on the UN sanctions. We've tried to put tougher sanctions on Iran through the UN because then the whole international community is obliged to follow them. And the Chinese, they've gone along with what we did in June, but they were weaker than we would have preferred. And it is driven by their oil. As I mentioned, other producers, particularly the Saudis, are trying to show the Chinese that there are other sources of their oil. Iraqi production is increasing sharply, and that could replace Iranian oil. So perhaps the Chinese will become more cooperative. But so far, they've been the brake on the sanctions policy.
One of the common threads here in the Arab uprising is the whole issue of social networking. And it's simply different from diplomacy. So if we follow the diplomatic track and we still do I call it Voice of America because I'm old enough. This whole social networking environment, do you see it as a productive tool or unintended consequences?
Well, I think it certainly can be used. The question is whether social networking and the new technologies can be used, communications technologies can be used in support of diplomacy. And I think the answer is yes, we certainly can. The more the people in Iran are exposed to what's happening elsewhere in the world, the more they see people in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Syria rising up against governments that are off, and the more that word is spread among these people, whether it's through cell phones or Facebook or whatever, or Voice of America, which does still do programming. I've been on it, and BBC has Farsi language programming to Iran. So yes, public diplomacy using whatever means available can certainly help.
Well, let's thank Barry for that comment.